This event is an in-conversation event with the Right Honourable Andrew Mitchell MP. Andrew was appointed as a Minister of State in the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office in October 2022. He was previously Secretary of State for International Development from 2010 to 2012. He was elected Conservative MP for Sutton Coldfield in 2001. This event is being hosted by the Coalition for Global Prosperity and WaterAid. The Coalition for Global Prosperity exists to champion the UK as a force for good in the world. We believe that with a strong and effective aid budget, partnered with an effective development and defence strategy, the UK can deliver for the world's poorest people. WaterAid are a not-for-profit, and they work around the world to make sure that people have access to clean water, decent toilets and good hygiene, and they want to achieve this within a generation. This event will explore the role of UK development within wider foreign policy and look at water, sanitation and hygiene.
So, those are the formalities. Now we can dive straight into questions. My first question, Andrew, is you're coming up for a year in post. You held the DFID brief about 10 years ago, just over 10 years ago. Can you tell us what has changed, what has surprised you, for good or for bad?
Well, thank you very much, Ryan. It's a pleasure to do another interview with you. I was rather hoping you'd be in the House of Commons by now, because I know you narrowly missed by 145 votes. So there were about 80 wrong-uns who got it wrong. But I'm sure you will be in the House of Commons soon, and that will be very good for the House of Commons and for the Conservative Party. So best of luck with that. Yes, it's. I think back to last year's conference, which was a bit ragged at the edges, and then of course I was a poacher, but now I'm a gamekeeper again, and I spent 10 years really since I was last in government. So I'm really an example of political life after death, really. But you also missed out the fact that I was in Parliament between 1987 and 97. So I go back even further. I'm the only member of the Cabinet today who was in that Parliament between 87 and 92. And I think there's a bit too much gloom and doom around at this party conference. I remember the period between, just a sort of preface before I come to your question, but I remember this time in 91, 92, before that election. And there are great similarities. The Tory party did not believe it could win an election in 92 under John Major. We were very despondent, and we were very surprised to win. And if you remember, everyone thought we were going to lose. There was the Sheffield Wednesday rally for Neil Kinnock, announcing victory just before the polling day. The electorate took a different view. But there was also lots of other things as well, that John Major was thought unlikely to win. And the proof of the fact that we didn't expect to win is the fact that if you look at the manifesto in 1992, you'll find there's absolutely nothing in it at all. There's nothing there. And it was because everyone thought that we were bound to lose, but we didn't. And I put it to you that if we are sensible and we focus on the key interests of our constituents, after what has been a very difficult time with COVID and Ukraine, if we focus on the things that matter to our constituents, then there is absolutely nothing which stands between us and winning the next election. But it will require focus, loyalty, unity, not, as I said in an interview in The Guardian this morning, not arguing the toss with the commanding officer in the foothills of a battle, but getting stuck in behind the commanding officer. So that is what I wanted to say by preface. Now, a lot has changed in 10 years, but don't focus only on the money, because actually we are spending today about the same amount as Labour was spending when they left office in 2010. So it's about a much more complicated world. It's a world in which the international system has broken down. You can't have a member of the Permanent Five at the United Nations invading their neighbour in breach of all international law, rules, human rights, humanitarian law, invading their neighbour, butchering their citizens and bombing their infrastructure. I mean, if we allow that to happen, if it stands, what does it say about the state of the world today? And it makes the world that much more dangerous. And the truth is that this has happened on the back of maybe some bad mistakes in Syria, where President Obama made it clear to the Russians and the Syrian regime that if they crossed a red line by using chemical weapons, the United States would retaliate. And they did cross the line, and the United States did nothing. And whether it's that or whether it's something else, we live in a world where we really need the international system to work hard to tackle problems we have in common: climate change, pandemics, protectionism, migration, terrorism, all these different things. You need an effective international rules-based system of the sort that Britain understood back after the Second World War in 1946 needed to be set up, and learn from the failure of the League of Nations, set up the United Nations. We understood how important this was. So at the very time when we do need to have international cooperation, we do need to cooperate on all those different things that I just mentioned, we live in an era of narrow nationalism. And, you know, wherever you look, whether it's Xi, Trump, Modi, Erdogan, it's the era of the strong man. And it is man, not woman. It's a strong man. As I say, I think that is a very, very big change since 10 years ago. And, you know, Britain does still show signs of real development leadership. Later today, it will be announced that the Jenner Institute in Oxford has developed a second malaria vaccine. I mean, this is earth-changing for the thousands of children who die every day from malaria. A vaccine like this, it's different from the first one. I'm not a scientist, so I can't talk about the efficacy of it. But it's certainly much cheaper than the first one, and it's certainly much easier to deliver in bulk than the first one. And this is huge change, immensely important to our world, and it's delivered by British science and British research and British development. So there are grounds for optimism, but the world has changed a lot. We've lost some of the heft in terms of international development, and one of the reasons why the Prime Minister asked me to come back and do this job is, I think, to see what we can do together to revivify, rejuvenate, regenerate a bit more oomph in international development. And I think there are some examples of that. We are seeing the Prime Minister at the G20 announce that Britain would provide $2,000 million of replenishment for the Green Climate Fund, the most important central fund in tackling climate change. We are going to publish on November the 20th a white paper. The white paper is Britain's contribution to thinking, particularly about two things. First, that the SDGs, these goals which David Cameron was pivotal in organising through the international system, these goals are way off course at this halfway point, and we need to get back on course. We're currently slated to miss almost all of them. 88% of the goals are off course, and we need to work out how we put that right. And secondly, we need to respond to Mia Mottley, the Prime Minister of Barbados's clarion call, tweaking the conscience of the world about the failure to deliver, particularly on adaptation, but also mitigation on climate finance. And we need to respond to that. And we are responding. The World Bank meeting in 10 days' time will specifically look at ways of turning, as she puts it, billions into trillions of pounds for tackling climate change, for producing climate finance. And the white paper will focus on how we do that. And in particular, what we're looking for, and I'm not sure we found it yet, is the holy grail of how you add the state funding, the funding from the funding from the multilateral development banks, organisation like Britain's DFI, BII, formerly CDC, undoubtedly now the most effective development finance institution in the world. How you take that state money and you marry it together with the $60 trillion of pension funds, which are looking specifically for a way of investing safely their pension the pension funders' money. And if you think about it, if you are a pension funder sitting in one of the great financial centres, you'll be very happy to invest 5% of the funds in tackling climate change, so long as you are reasonably sure you understand the risk and there's the prospect of a 5% or whatever return for those whose money you are managing. And finding a way to engage in that way on tackling climate change would be really, really important. And of course, if we're successful as an international community in doing these two things, tackling climate change and dealing with the SDGs being so off track, we will avoid the north-south divide, which has got much worse over recent years. We saw it at the Glasgow COP. It got a lot louder in Egypt last year. The noise and anger and hurt of the global south that the rich countries weren't doing their stuff. And if we're able, through this white paper, to move the dial a bit, that will be a sign that Britain is doing its bit, making its contribution internationally to changing things. And if I just say one more thing about the white paper. The white paper has to be, if you think about it, has to be all-party. Why? Because the result of the next general election is not in the hands of the Labour Party or the Conservative Party. It is in the hands of the electorate. It's called democracy. No one knows what that result is going to be. But if the white paper only went to the next election, then it wouldn't engage brilliant people across Whitehall, across the research sectors, across our great universities and internationally, won't engage if they think that it is a conservative government paper. It's got to be wider. It's got to be a British paper, and it's got to go to 2030. And on that basis, it is an all-party effort. Of course, the government, it's a command paper from the government, it's a white paper, but we have had over 60 countries help by making submissions. We've had over 500 submissions, huge amounts from Britain, but other countries too. And my ambition is that when the Prime Minister launches it on November the 20th, that in physical or electronic form, we are proud of it. And in Britain, in the sector, we push it round, we give it to people, we ask their opinion, we ask them to use it, but also across the international financial and development sectors, the centres like Addis Ababa, Geneva, New York and Washington and London and so forth, that it is read with interest internationally, and people feel that Britain has put together a proposal, a set of ideas that help drive those two critical agendas for our world forward. And the final point I would just say on this is that no one's in any doubt now about climate change. The world is burning up. We see it before our eyes. The oceans are dying. The chemical change is extraordinary that's taking place. And we saw brush fires in inner London, which we've never seen before last year. So no one's in any doubt. This is the existential crisis of our time. And that is why international development, Britain's putting its DNA into it, working together through the international system, these things that I've been saying have changed in the last 10 years. That is why it's so important.
Thank you, Andrew. For those who aren't familiar with all of Andrew's career, Andrew is the reason that international development has been such a core plank of Conservative policy over the past 20 years. He's really led the way both in government and out of government. So my question, Andrew, is support for international development in both the Conservative Party and the country stronger or weaker than it was 10 years ago? And I ask that particularly because I'm delighted to see lots of Conservative parliamentary candidates in the room, and I'm sure they will need galvanising and revving up as they head into that election campaign.
Well, it is different, but what I think you think I'm going to say is that Boris did a lot of damage to it, and that it's not where it was 10 years ago. But I would like to make a different point to that. The point I would like to make is this: that the world is very different now. The political cycle is very different now. Back in 2005, when David Cameron brought the Conservative Party into the modern age. And I think there's no question I led the campaign of his opponent to be leader of the party, and we came second. But I think, you have to hand it to David. He did make the party electable. He made it look more like the country we seek to serve, and in a lot of ways. And of course, he was a passionate supporter of the causes of international development. And for me, when I was his development minister, it was an absolutely blessed relationship because, he and I would vie with each other. He, as Prime Minister, to read the drafts of Paul Collier's books, and would then vie with each other who got hold of the copy first. We could complete each other's sentences, and he did an enormous amount internationally to drive forward this agenda. And so within the party, we set up Project Umubano in Rwanda, which was an amazing project. I mean, it certainly changed my life, and I think it changed the lives of lots of people who went on it. On one occasion, we had 100 Conservative volunteers in Kigali in Rwanda, from the shadow cabinet through to young researchers, and we were able to subsidise the cost so that cost was not a factor, and encouraging people to come out and see in a poor country what worked and what didn't work in tackling poverty and driving forward international development. And as I said, we had 100 people down there. The president said to me he thought we might win a by-election in Kigali South while we were there. So that sort of brought together a team of people who felt very strongly about the Point 7. And, we formed CFID, which had its meeting last night, which is run so brilliantly by Liz Sugg, and by Anthony Magnell, which is the core of people in Parliament and outside who care very deeply about this. And I can tell you that I'm so proud of having served in a government that didn't talk about it, but did it. It was the first G7 country to reach Point 7. The Labour Party talked about it for years and years and years, but they didn't reach it. It was the Conservative Party that delivered the Point 7. Now, you may say to me, so what a blow it is that we're now at Point 5. To which I would say to you, that was the decision of Parliament. Parliament agreed that with the very unusual and different circumstances of COVID, we should lower the Point 7 to Point 5 temporarily. And the government is committed to bringing it back when the fiscal tests are satisfied. I notice that Labour have not said that they will bring it back ahead of those fiscal tests. So, it wasn't my view, but the Parliament accepted the view of the government that we needed to temporarily lower it to 0.5. And my job now is to try and make sure that we make back that 0.2%, and we are doing it, make back that 0.2% by finding other means to help fund international development. And some of those will be augmented in the white paper, but Britain has produced, in addition to the 0.5, something like £5,000 million of guarantees which have enabled the multilateral banks to produce much more money. Chancellor of the Exchequer, Jeremy Hunt, announced at the IMF that we would effectively put into the two poverty funds of the IMF £5 billion, so that's £10 billion of extra money. And we are doing co-funding with other countries. We're doing co-funding in the Horn of Africa on humanitarian work. I hope that the Prime Minister will announce when the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia is here that we're going to do some specific things together on the humanitarian space in very poor countries around the world. We are finding ways of ensuring that although the money that Britain produces directly has temporarily diminished, we are making up for it in the other things that we are doing. We are finding multipliers for the money to drive forward our ambitions on international development.
Thank you very much. Let's take some questions. Tim, your hand is up.
Oh, thank you.
There's a mic coming.
Sorry. Thank you. Tim Wainwright from WaterAid. So all over the world, in every country that WaterAid is working, we can see the impact of climate change, as you said. And it's often about changes in weather patterns. So when historically you've seen sort of 10 storms in one season, it's replaced by one single downpour where all the water falls at one time. You're getting floods, you're getting droughts, and you get rapid runoff, so the groundwater's not replenished. And these are the countries that did the least to cause climate change. So your point is very well made on the north-south politics that can result from paying too little attention to this. I've loved your comments on the emphasis on adaptation and resilience in poorest countries. But could you tell us a little bit more about what you plan to do to improve water resilience and adaptation in the poorest countries in the world?
So thank you very much indeed. And you run a great organisation, which I've always been a very strong supporter of. I think when we met before, I said to you that I had developed quite a deep knowledge of latrines and hygiene in camps all around the world, and it's true. But I've always been a great supporter, and I think you won't mind me saying that before he became the king, your president, the final award he signed before he became the king, when he was still the Prince of Wales, was very generously to me. So I'm very proud of that, and it sits in my office. Earlier this year, there were two big meetings, one in Qatar and one in Riyadh, looking at the way in which we do humanitarian work. And at both those meetings, I tried to make the point that we need to set aside, when you go into a humanitarian situation, whether it's an earthquake or a flood or a famine, whatever it is, you need to set aside money to build in resilience and adaptation. So, for example, in your sector, there are examples of where we have had to ship water in Bowsers into areas of famine where the supply of water has dried up and where people are in urgent need of water. And the lesson we need to learn is, in those situations, how do you ensure that you build, as part of the work you're doing, you build in resilience and adaptation. So you provide for irrigation, you set up reservoir facilities so that water can be harvested and kept. And in your sector, that is the best example of how you build this in. And I think we're learning to do that better. Of course, it costs more money, and so we have to budget accordingly. But next year, we've got the budget under much better control now, partly because of this new committee that we've set up, a Star Chamber committee in Whitehall, co-chaired by me and the Chief Secretary, to bring greater order to the budget. So we're able to say not only that we can plan to double bilateral spending in Africa next year, but also that we will spend at least £1,000 million on humanitarian work next year, and we will also have a crisis reserve, which we haven't been able to have recently. So better control of the budget gives us better opportunity to do the things that you and I really want to see happen.
We only have the Minister for a very short amount of time, so we're going to take 3 quick questions. I'm going to Claudia first.
Hello, Minister. I'm not content with quizzing you last night, also quizzing you a bit today. Claudia from the International Rescue Committee. I wanted to ask about the Women and Girls strategy and how you see, both within the white paper later this year, but also over the years, the role of women within development, and specifically women-led organisations. And I don't just mean as recipients of aid, but as key players in achieving a lot of the goals that the UK wants to see in the developing countries. Thank you.
So one might just take a few.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
Just go here, and then in the front row, Les.
Thelma Mattert from Sutton Coldfield. Hello, Andrew. With all the coups taking place in Africa, how can we be sure that the money gets to where we need it to be and it doesn't land in the hands of, for example, China or other people?
And then David Burrows.
David Burrows, Southgate and Custodial Christian Fellowship. Andrew, thank you so much for your advocacy of the international rules-based system in the face of authoritarian nationalism. How much do you think that's consistent with our domestic politics and narrative and some of the rhetoric? And is that impacting on our brand and ability to win votes?
Could you just say a bit more about that?
Just whether, quite rightly, are championing the international rules-based system in the face of authoritarian nationalism. Whether, when we look across government and hear various rhetoric in relation to how we're handling the issues of migration and how it flows into our own borders, whether we're being truly consistent in some of the rhetoric on our leadership and our force for good on an international stage.
Okay, so to turn to the first and the last question, first of all, one of the things that really impressed me when I came back into government in the Foreign Office, and whatever you think about the merger, there are two very good things that resulted. One of which is that the UK platform overseas should be run by the High Commissioner or the Ambassador. And in the past, not when I was Development Secretary, I hasten to add, but there have been, DFID had pursued its own foreign policy from time to time. But you can't do that. So that is one good thing about it. It's one platform with one leader overseas, pushing forward British interests, making sure that we do the right thing. And the other thing was that they have really internalised the importance of women and girls in all areas of public policy. And we all know that you can't understand international development unless you see it through the eyes of girls and women, because they are the people who suffer first and foremost from poverty and all the things that go with poverty. So I mean, I was really, really impressed by that. And we are moving to a position where the issue and requirements and needs and the leadership, your second point, the leadership of girls and women really is embedded in everything we do. So, I take my hat off to the Foreign Office, much better than it had been 10 years previously, without any question. On your point, I mean, I think one of the terrible things about my rant about how the international system has been pushed back and pushed down, the rights of women are being pushed back in Afghanistan and in the Supreme Court in America. So this is a really broadly spread attack on the rights of women. We're seeing it, some of the moral majority in America as well. But also, if across Africa, you look at the way in which LGBT rights are under threat. I went to, when I was in Ghana, I went to meet the Foreign Affairs Select Committee of the Ghanaian Parliament, and they are contemplating a law against LGBT rights. So I pulled out my camera and showed them a picture of the wedding photograph of my beloved daughter marrying her girlfriend a year ago, and they've just produced a grandson for the Mitchell family. And I passed this round, and all these men, they were all men on this committee, they were all sort of looking at this picture. And afterwards, several of them said to me, you have been on a journey way ahead of us. We are on the same journey too. And I think we have the tone of the way we argue about this. I mean, what's happened in Uganda is absolutely terrible. Other countries are contemplating similar things in Africa. We have to argue our point in a respectful way and not be too strident, but we also have to be effective. It's quite difficult line to tread, but the brilliance of British diplomats ensures that we tread it as best we can. So these rights are being rolled back. And to your specific point, I mean, I'm not going to get involved in Suella's terminology, but the point is this, that I think what she was saying is not particularly exceptional about multiculturalism. Is not particularly, I mean, people will say these things in different ways, but I don't think we should get too hung up on that. And then to Thelma from the Royal Town of Sutton Coldfield, very nice to see you. The prevalence of coups is quite extraordinary. They're almost all in former French colonies, you'll have noticed. But we have seen this coup in Gabon, which is very different from the coup in Niger. I mean, I think the coup in Gabon, a number of people in Africa said they're surprised it took so long, because the Bongo dynasty was looking quite difficult. The coup in Niger, of course, is very, very sad indeed. Niger was the one brilliant example in the Sahel of a country that was making real progress, not just against the terrorists, but also in terms of development. Now, this is a country where the president told me that in the region from which he came, 50% of the girls aged 15 were married and pregnant. So, it is a country where, the rights of girls and women were being advanced by a very good president. And obviously the coup that's taken place is enormously depressing. The British, the way we are approaching it is to support ECOWAS and the African Union in trying to make sure that constitutional propriety is restored as quickly as possible. And, we will continue to give maximum support we can to President Tinubu of Nigeria, who is the leader of ECOWAS, and to the African Union.
Let's take 3 more quick questions. Who else has got the mic? Lois is trying to get through. Gentleman in the to the left, on the left-hand side, and then who else? And then Megan afterwards. And then
Hi, James Bolton-Jones from the NGO Spotlight on Corruption. Sustainable Development Goal 16.4 refers to returning stolen assets that have been laundered back to the countries of origin. How important does the Minister think this SDG is? And relatedly, what steps is he taking to try and ensure that overseas territories of the UK pass new beneficial owner registers by the deadline, which is, I believe, the end of this year? Thanks very much.
And then Megan.
Hi, Megan Rowland Deverell from Tier Fund. I'd really love to hear, Minister, your thoughts on the role of local NGOs, both in humanitarian response and in development, and particularly local faith actors in those spaces, and how the UK government can be engaging more with them, making it more easy for them to access funding and so on.
And gentleman here, and then, because this will be the last round, just lead it back.
Thanks very much. Daniel Thornton from Gavi. Minister, you've been very eloquent on the need to mitigate the impact of climate change. And as you know, Gavi, very much supported by the UK, funds vaccines which help protect against diseases that are spreading as a result of climate change, including malaria that you mentioned earlier. Do you agree that that's important to bring out these wider benefits of immunisation in terms of mitigating climate, as well as, of course, saving millions of lives? This is a leading question, Minister. Do you agree?
Just one last quick question at the back.
It's a really difficult one, yeah.
Hello, Minister. It's Sophie Powell from Christian Aid. Good to see you. Thanks very much for today. It's been really encouraging, both today and in recent speeches you've made, to hear about your commitment to doing more on adaptation. We think that's incredibly important in terms of supporting the most vulnerable people on the front line of the climate crisis. At the same time, with sort of constrained aid budget, you're increasingly talking about the billions to trillions agenda and World Bank leveraging and so on and so forth. Which is, we recognise that can be a source of finance, but very little of leveraged finance, as you probably know, thus far ever goes to adaptation projects because they're just not profitable. I mean, we can see how that works in many cases for mitigation projects, but very little for adaptation. I think it's about 2% at the moment that goes to adaptation through leveraged financing. So I'm just wondering if you could say a bit more about what your thinking is on that, because it seems very clear that there is going to be a need for more public financing to be channeled if we're going to meet our obligations on adaptation, and if we want 50% of our international climate finance commitments to go to adaptation, as the UK has promised.
Okay, so stolen assets. This will be a key feature of the white paper. It's something the Prime Minister put into the integrated review in March this year. And as you rightly implied, we have to be careful because we have questions to answer on this. According to the National Crime Agency, 40% of the stolen assets come through London and the overseas territories and the Crown dependents, 40%. And the estimate for money, illicit finance, money stolen from Africa and Africans by bent businessmen, corrupt warlords and politicians last year was £88 billion. So it dwarfs the flows of development money. And we have to do something about it. And you're quite right to ask the critical question is whether or not the OTs and the CDs will deliver by the end of this year. And the answer is that they must deliver, because that's the commitment that was made to Parliament. When I was a poacher rather than a gamekeeper, Margaret Hodge from the Labour Party and I worked very hard together to make sure that that happens. So you are pinpointing a critical issue which we will address. Megan, on localism and the importance of localism, I completely agree, and you will have noticed that Samantha Powers has championed this at USAID. And we recognise that we need to move in that direction. We must do it responsibly, but clearly partnership leads to localism, and we need to champion that. Finally, Daniel, Gavi, benefits of immunisation. When we did the Gavi replenishment in 2011, we raised an enormous amount of money, including €5,000 from the Vatican. We discovered that 83% of the British public approved of that process. And even the monarchy, I don't think, gets 83% appreciation from the British public. You may wonder about the other 17%, but 83% is very good. So the answer to your very generous question is that the benefits of immunisation are immense. And this announcement that's going to be made, I think, at 2:30 by the World Health Organization this afternoon underlines the importance of that to Britain and the importance in terms of effectiveness. And finally, Sophie, you are completely right. Britain has always seen its role within the G7, the G7 countries, particularly at the World Bank, but also at the United Nations, of focusing on the poorest countries and making sure that the focus is on that. And we are focused on the less developed countries and adaptation. The Prime Minister announced that we would increase from 2019 £500 million of adaptation money up to, by 2026, to 1.5 billion every year. And we are focused also through the Green Climate Fund, where I met the head of the fund and said that we wanted to see far more done on adaptation, and that I wanted to see when she first did a project in Somalia, which was on adaptation. So we are exactly where you want us to be. And the final point I would make about adaptation rolls into the point I made about how we do humanitarian work. We are very committed to this, and we will make sure you hold us to account on this. And in dealing with organisations like BII, which has an immense impact, and where the Select Committee has produced a very, very good report, we will try and make sure that more British equity investment goes into projects in the poorest countries, which also do adaptation. It's quite easy to find money for mitigation projects in middle-income countries like India. Adaptation in poorer countries is more difficult, but we are on the case.
The Minister needs to be away, but just before we do, Andrew, any final words of...
No, Richard Darlington at the back has been sending me signals for the last 5 minutes, which indicate that I should leave.
That's why I was avoiding his gaze.
I'm so sorry, but thank you all so much for...
Can we show our appreciation?